The house was never loud. That was the thing no one understood when Leonora tried to explain it. Years later, they expected her to describe shouting, or cold silences broken by slammed doors, or some dramatic rupture that split a marriage clean in two. But the Hargrove house on Caldwell Street was simply quiet in the way a room is quiet after something has left it. Not peaceful. Emptied. She had come to it at 23, in the January of 1887, as the new Mrs. Hargrove. The wedding had been arranged between her father and Douglas Hargrove's father over a timber contract, and a shared concern about Leonora's prospects, which her father discussed with the same businesslike efficiency he applied to freight routes. Douglas was 31. He had a good jaw and a firm handshake, and he did not drink to excess. Her mother had called these things virtues. Leonora had called them the minimum evidence that a man was still breathing. She had not gone into the marriage hating him. That was important, she thought to say clearly. She had gone in hoping, not for love. She was not naive enough at 23 to expect that from a man who had looked at her the way Douglas looked at furniture, assessing its function before accepting it into a room. But she had hoped for something warmer than furniture. A partner, perhaps. Someone who would speak to her at breakfast about something other than the weather or the week's accounts. For 8 years he had spoken to her about the weather and the week's accounts. She ran his house. She kept the ledger he handed her each month and stretched every dollar to its edges. She managed the domestic staff. 2 women, a cook and a girl who came 3 days a week. And she organized his dinners, and remembered the names of his business associates' wives, and attended the church functions that reflected well on a man of Douglas Hargrove's standing in Millhaven, Virginia. She did all of it without being asked, because that was the understanding, though it was never spoken. That was the contract her father had signed on her behalf at 23. What she had not understood then was that performing a role and being seen in it are 2 entirely different things. Douglas saw the house as orderly. He saw the dinners as well executed. He saw the accounts as balanced. He had never once seen her. She understood this slowly, the way you understand a change in season. Not in a single moment, but through 100 small accumulations. The time she told him about the book she had read, all of her own enthusiasm still warm in her voice, and he said, and turned the page of his newspaper. The time she sat across from him at the Christmas table, with their guests, and realized she had been speaking for 2 minutes about the flooding on the South Road, and Douglas had been nodding at the right intervals, without hearing a single word. The time she was ill for 5 days in February, and he had asked on the 4th day whether she thought she would be well enough to attend the Whitfields' dinner on Saturday, because it would look strange if she weren't there. She had been. She had worn the green dress he preferred and smiled at Mrs. Whitfield's jokes, and felt, somewhere around the soup course, the first clear thought, I am not a wife, I am a prop. She did not leave then. She did not leave for 3 more years. There was the practicality of it. Where would she go? On what money? To what life? There was her mother's voice in her ear, telling her that all marriages were difficult, and that a good woman managed her disappointments quietly. There was the embarrassment of it, the sheer social cost, in a town like Millhaven, where everyone knew the Hargroves, and the name she had been given along with the house on Caldwell Street. And there was, if she was honest, a stubborn, remaining hope. The kind that does not die easily because it has never actually been tested. She had never asked Douglas directly for what she needed, had never said the words plainly, and there was a part of her that clung to the possibility that if she did, if she simply told him, something might shift. She tried it once. The spring of 1895, after 8 years. She sat down at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning after the girl had cleared the dishes and said, Douglas, I need to talk to you about something. He set his paper down. He looked at her with the expression he used for unexpected items in the accounts. Not hostile, but alert for problems. She had rehearsed it. She said it clearly, that she felt invisible in this house, that she needed him to speak to her as a person rather than a function, that she was asking him, not demanding, just asking, if they could find a way to be something more to each other than what they currently were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Leonora, you manage this house exceptionally well. I have never once complained. And he picked up his paper. She sat at the table for a long time after he left for his office. The morning light came through the window the way it always did, laying itself across the tablecloth in a long yellow stripe. The house was quiet. She sat in it and felt something harden in her chest. Not dramatically, not with tears. Just a slow solidification, like water finding the temperature at which it finally becomes something else. She began, after that, to think in practical terms. The money was the first problem. She had managed the household accounts for 8 years and had an intimate knowledge of what things cost and what was available. She had no personal account, no savings in her own name. But there was the household cash, the amount Douglas set aside each month for domestic expenses, and she began, carefully, to hold a small amount back. Not stealing. She told herself it was not stealing, because it was money she had earned, and then some, because she had built this household's comfort with her own time and intelligence for 8 years without a salary. She kept the amount small. She kept the ledger balanced. Over 14 months, she accumulated $43 and some change, folded and sewn into the lining of a winter coat Douglas had never once noticed she owned. The destination was the second problem. She had an aunt, her mother's sister, Rosalind, who had moved to Charlottesville 20 years earlier and married a man named Prentice, and then survived him, and was now, as far as Leonora knew, living alone in a house she owned outright. They had not been close. There had been letters at Christmas and a visit when Leonora was 12, that she remembered mainly for the smell of Rosalind's garden, and the way Rosalind had spoken to her like a person rather than a child. She did not know if Rosalind would take her in. But she wrote a letter, careful, brief, honest, and Rosalind wrote back 3 weeks later and said, "Come when you're ready. The room is here." That was the fall of 1895. She read the letter on the porch, and then burned it, because Douglas sometimes looked through her correspondence without mentioning it. She was nearly ready, by the first week of November. She had a plan, the coat with the money, and a small travel bag packed and hidden in the back of the wardrobe. She had written out the train schedule from Millhaven to Charlottesville twice, once for the early train and once for the late one. She had done everything she could think to do. What she had not planned for was the evening of November 8th. Douglas had 2 colleagues to dinner that night, men from his business, a Mr. Aldous Crane, and a younger man named Pell who was being considered for some partnership. Douglas had been vague about. Leonora had prepared the dinner, managed the conversation, kept Mrs. Aldous Crane from being bored while the men talked business at the table, and then excused herself around 9 o'clock on the pretext of a headache, which was not entirely untrue. She went to the kitchen for water. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it shared a wall with the study where the men had retired after dinner. The wall was old. The plaster was thin in places. She had known this for years, had sometimes heard Douglas's voice through it without meaning to, a low murmur of business she had no interest in. That night she was not trying to listen. She was pouring water into a glass when she heard her own name. She went still. Crane's voice, indistinct at first, and then, "Leonora, manages him," more like, laughter. Douglas's laugh, which she recognized. A short, dismissive sound, like a man clearing a minor obstacle. Then Douglas's voice, clear enough that she understood every word. "She manages the house. That's what she was arranged for. I have never asked her to be anything more than that, and she has never disappointed me. As long as the accounts balance, I don't see why I should require more from a wife than I require from a housekeeper." More laughter. Pell, this time, young and eager to amuse. She stood in the kitchen with the glass in her hand. She did not cry. She noticed that about herself later, that there were no tears, not then. What there was instead was a strange, absolute clarity, like a lamp being turned up in a room that has been dim for years. She could see everything in it suddenly, the shape of the last 11 years, the dinner she had cooked tonight, the ledger she kept, the green dress she had worn to the Whitfields' dinner 5 years ago, when she was running a fever, because it would look strange if she weren't there. She manages the house. That's what she was arranged for. She set the glass down on the counter. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to the bedroom. She took the coat from the wardrobe. She put on her heaviest shoes. She took the travel bag from the back of the wardrobe and checked it by feel, her hands steady and quiet, the way her hands got when she had made a decision, and the time for deliberating was entirely past. She did not write a note. She had considered this. She had almost written one, once, in a version of this moment she had played through in her mind during the long flat evenings of the last 14 months. But she thought of Douglas reading it at the breakfast table, with the same expression he used for unexpected account items, and she thought of him writing back to her in Charlottesville, with the same measured, business-like tone he used for freight correspondence, and she decided that there was nothing she wanted to say to him that he had the capacity to hear. She had said it all once, at the breakfast table in the spring of 1895, and he had picked up his paper. She took her bag and went down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out the door. The night was cold. November in Millhaven was not delicate about it. There was a hard freeze coming. She could smell it in the air, that particular sharpness that meant ice by morning. She walked quickly, her bag over one arm, the coat buttoned to the collar. The streets were dark. She had 4 blocks to the station, and then she would wait for the 11:15 train, which she had memorized, which stopped at 3 towns before Charlottesville. She did not look back at the house. She had half expected, in the dramatized version of this moment that she had imagined, to feel something crumble in her. The sentimental version of this departure, the one where a woman glances back at the life she is leaving and allows herself one moment of grief. But what she felt instead, walking those 4 dark blocks to the station, was lighter than she had been in years. Not happy, not yet, but unburdened, in a way that was almost physical, as if she had set down something she had been carrying in a particular position for so long that she had stopped noticing the weight. The station was nearly empty. A porter, a woman with a child, a man asleep on a bench. The woman at the ticket window looked at Leonora for a moment. It was 11 o'clock at night, a woman alone with a travel bag, and then sold her the ticket without comment. People who work late stations, Leonora thought, have learned not to ask questions. She found a seat at the end of the platform and sat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it, and she breathed. She was 34 years old. She had $43. She had a winter coat and a bag packed with what she had deemed essential, which was not much. She had an aunt in Charlottesville who had left a room available. And she had something else, something she had not anticipated, the feeling settling over her in the cold night air of the Millhaven platform, of being exactly who she was. Not Mrs. Hargrove, not the woman who kept the accounts, not the housekeeper Douglas had described to his colleagues with such flat, unconscious accuracy. Just Leonora. 34, alive, getting on a train. The 11:15 was 7 minutes late. She watched it come in from the dark, and she picked up her bag and she got on. Rosalind Prentice was shorter than Leonora remembered, and her hair had gone entirely white, but her eyes were the same as they had been when Leonora was 12, quick and warm, and not interested in nonsense. She opened the door of the Charlottesville house at 7:15 in the morning, took one look at Leonora on the porch, and said, "Come in. There's coffee." That was all. No questions, no performance of concern. Just the door opening and the smell of coffee and the ordinary mercy of a woman who has lived long enough to know what is needed without being told. Rosalind's house was small and warm and entirely her own. It smelled like dried lavender and wood smoke and something Leonora could not identify. A smell she would later decide was simply the smell of a house where no one performed happiness. Every room had books in it, stacked with a productive disregard for tidiness. There were plants on the windowsills. There was a cat who regarded Leonora with suspicious neutrality for 3 days before permitting her to sit on the sofa. Rosalind had neighbors, and among them was a woman named Eugenia Marsh, who was 50-something and brisk and ran, from the 2 front rooms of her house on Barton Street, a small enterprise that had started as a lending library and had grown, over 15 years, into something that also involved correspondence courses for women who wanted to improve their reading and arithmetic, and occasionally, quietly, informally, helped women who arrived in Charlottesville with very little and needed to understand the practical mechanics of beginning again. Rosalind brought Leonora to meet Eugenia on her 3rd day in Charlottesville. Eugenia looked at her over a cup of tea and said, "What can you do?" Leonora said. "I can keep accounts, I can manage a household budget, I can organize schedules and correspondence and staff." She paused. "I have been doing it for 11 years for someone who described me as a housekeeper," Eugenia said. "Good. I need someone to manage mine." It was not at first a salary. It was room and board, and a small arrangement that grew, over the following months, as Leonora proved herself indispensable. Not by shrinking, but by doing exactly what she had always done, with the single, enormous difference that Eugenia noticed. Eugenia said thank you when she meant it. Eugenia asked Leonora's opinion about the correspondence course materials, and then actually listened to the answer. Eugenia, one afternoon in February, showed Leonora the accounts for the enterprise and asked her to find where the inefficiency was. And when Leonora found it in 20 minutes and explained it, Eugenia laughed with genuine delight and said, "I have been losing $40 a quarter to that for 3 years." That was the first time Leonora laughed in Charlottesville. She noticed it happening, the way you notice your hand opening after it has been closed for a long time. The question of the marriage, of Douglas, of the house on Caldwell Street, of the legal machinery of ending what had been legally begun, was not simple. Leonora knew this. There was no clean door marked exit that a woman could walk through in 1895 and find herself on the other side free and unmarked. A divorce required grounds that the courts recognized, and required a process, and required a lawyer, and required time. Eugenia knew a lawyer. His name was Mr. Aldrich, and he had handled 2 separations for women connected to Eugenia's circle, and he was quiet and careful and did not look at Leonora as if her situation was a problem she had brought on herself. He told her what the process would require. He told her what to document, what to record, what to preserve. He told her it would take time. She said she had learned to be patient. He said, "In this case, patience is a strategy." Douglas did not come to Charlottesville. She had wondered if the affront to his household order would require him to retrieve what had, in his accounting, simply gone missing. But she heard nothing for 6 weeks, and then a letter arrived through Mr. Aldrich's office, businesslike and controlled, which said that Douglas wished to understand her intentions and to discuss the matter of the house and its contents. She replied through Mr. Aldrich's office. Her intentions were formal and specific and did not leave room for negotiation about the things she had already decided. Douglas wrote he was not, in the end, a man given to dramatic opposition. What he was, she had always known, was a man who calculated costs. The cost of contesting this, the social expense of it, the legal complexity, the long inconvenience, would exceed, in his accounting, the cost of simply letting her go, and the house on Caldwell Street ran perfectly well without her. He would hire a housekeeper. He had, in a sense, always thought he had one. The legal process took 18 months. She was 36 when it was finalized. On a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1897, in the offices of Mr. Aldrich on Market Street, she signed her name, the one she had been born with, which she was taking back, and walked out into the April afternoon and sat down on a bench on the edge of the street and held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Leonora. Not Mrs. Hargrove. Not the woman who balanced the accounts for a man who would always see her as a function. Just Leonora, 36 years old, with a name and a spring afternoon and somewhere to be. She had been working with Eugenia for a year and a half by then. The arrangement had grown into a proper position with a proper salary, and she had moved out of Rosalind's spare room and into 2 rooms of her own on a quiet street 3 blocks from Eugenia's house. The rooms were small and not particularly elegant, but they were hers. The lease was in her name. The decisions were hers. The books stacked on the floor were books she had chosen. The cat from Rosalind's house had decided, without anyone's permission, to relocate. In the 2 rooms on the quiet street, Leonora began to write. It started as letters, correspondence for Eugenia's women who needed help formulating requests to official bodies, or explaining their situations to lawyers, or simply writing clearly about what had happened to them. Leonora was good at this. She had a plain, precise way with language, and she could find the sentence that said the important thing without excess. And she could take a woman's tangled, tearful account of a situation, and hold it up to the light and find the shape of it. She wrote letter after letter on behalf of women she had met through Eugenia's circle, and something in the work satisfied her in a way she could not entirely explain. The feeling of being useful in a way that was seen, that produced a result, that meant something beyond the balancing of accounts. And then one of Eugenia's women, a young widow named Ames, with small children and very little, told Leonora that the letter she had written to the county assessor had gotten her what she needed. She sat across from Leonora at Eugenia's table and said, "I couldn't have written that. I wouldn't have known how." "How did you know what to say?" Leonora said. "I've had a lot of practice explaining situations that people didn't want to look at clearly." Mrs. Ames laughed. Then she looked at Leonora steadily and said, "You should teach it. Not just writing letters. How to think through a problem. How to ask for what you need without apologizing for needing it." She paused. "I needed someone to show me how to do that. I had to figure it out myself, but I shouldn't have had to." Leonora thought about it for 2 days. Then she went to Eugenia and proposed adding a session to the correspondence courses. Not arithmetic, not reading. Something harder. How to assess a situation clearly. How to know what you have and what you need and how to move from one to the other without losing yourself in the distance between them. Eugenia said, "I've been waiting for you to suggest that since November." The course ran for the first time in October of 1897, with 6 women around Eugenia's parlor table on Tuesday afternoons. Leonora taught it by beginning, every session, with the same question. What do you know for certain? Not what you feel, not what you hope, not what you've been told. What do you know right now, for certain? It was, she understood, the question she had finally learned to ask herself, standing in a kitchen in Millhaven on the night of November 8th. With a glass of water in her hand and the sound of her husband's voice coming through the wall. She did not know, then, everything she knew now. She had not known that Rosalind would take her in, or that Eugenia would recognize her value in 20 minutes, or that 2 rooms on a quiet street with a borrowed cat could feel more genuinely like a home than 11 years. In a house she had run impeccably. She had not known any of it. But she had known one thing, standing in that kitchen. She had known that staying was something she was no longer able to do. That had been enough. She was 38 when she wrote it all down. Not as a memoir, not for publication, but as a document for the women in her Tuesday sessions, a plain account of what she had done, and how and in what order, and what had helped. She wrote it without sentimentality and without bitterness, because both of those things, she had found, were less useful than clarity. She wrote about the coat. She wrote about the $43. She wrote about Mr. Aldrich and the 18 months and the paper she had signed on the Wednesday afternoon in April. She wrote, "I am not telling you this to tell you what to do. I am telling you this so that you know it has been done by someone with very little, with no guarantee of what was on the other side. That is the only thing I can honestly offer you, not a map, an account of terrain someone else has crossed. Start from what you know for certain. Go from there." At the top of the page she wrote her name, Leonora. Just that. No other name, no title, no address. It was enough.